Thank you. Everyone has an agenda. My name is Peterson Toscano, and you have come to a talk which is called Climate Change, What's Faith Got to Do with It? Well, that's how I hear it in my head with Tina Turner helping out. It's a very broad-sounding topic, and I need to warn you, I'm not a typical presenter. I am a performance artist, I'm a comic, I'm an actor. It will not be uncommon for me to break into character and perform in multiple voices before the night's over. Just don't let that freak you out. But the topic seems very broad. Faith, what's faith got to do with it? And approaching this topic, there's lots of ways that one could do it. Of course, one could talk about the Pope's encyclical, which I'm sure has been talked about, and you've got people who are far more qualified to talk about that at this university than I am. You can talk about it as a theological issue, the very crude question, what does the Bible say about climate change? You could talk about it as a moral issue, about ethics, social justice, human rights. It can be a practical issue, like raising the question, what role do churches and faith communities have on a changing planet? What practically can they offer their communities? It can be very much a pastoral question. What do people, lay ministers, priests, ministers of all sorts, what do they have to offer people at a time of climate change with so much uncertainty and fear? Definitely, there's a philosophical approach that we can take, looking at it as an existential issue, raising questions like, who are we on this planet at this wild time? And finally, it could be very much a deeply spiritual conversation. How is it to be a person of faith in a time of climate change? What spiritual practices can we develop and maintain in this changing time? In my presentation tonight, I will clearly touch on all of those, and in a way, it will be a primer. In any one of those topics, we can go deeply, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, so if there's a particular topic I brought up and you want to know more about, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. Now, with climate change, it's got to be understood. Can you hear me okay back there? I feel like the mic just dropped out. Is it on? Okay. It's very strange that I'm involved in climate change, actually. It's not a topic that I've ever took on. I'm not an environmentalist. I've never been. It's not that I'm an anti-environmentalist. I mean, I like clean air and I like clean water, but it's just never been my jam. I've never been involved with environmentalist organizations. I'm a human rights person. I'm a human rights campaigner. And, you know, I do like nature, but I equally like art museums, maybe a little bit more because there are less insects in art museums. In fact, I have to be honest, right now in America, I'm far more concerned and frightened by ticks and mosquitoes than by terrorism. I think there's far more risk there. But for me, I had an apocalypse, an epiphany about climate change, and it really gripped me. And to kind of help you understand the stages that I went through, because this often happens. It comes in waves, it comes in stages. I want to share with you a little monologue I created. It's called the 5 Stages of Hot Climate Action. And in it, I use 5 of my favorite characters, and I help myself and other people understand what was it from that moment I first began to be alarmed to the place where I came to a place of acceptance and understanding and engagement. What are all the phases that I went through? So, I warned you, I will go into character. Here are the 5 stages of hot climate action. The first stage is the freak out stage, you know, like when finally you see what's going on there. And strangely enough, my freak out voice sounds a lot like my dad, who's from the Bronx, a New Yorker. He was a Marine, Knights of Columbus kind of guy. And this is how my freak out voice sounds. Holy guacamole, it's the end of the world as we know it. Global warming is going to crush us. Drought, flood, pestilence, whatever that is. From the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream water, we're going to hell in a handbasket. Then after freaking out for a little bit, the pendulum then swung to the other side, and I toyed with denial. I didn't come right out and denied climate change, but I kind of like thought, and this is what my toying with denial voice sounds like. Yes, I am concerned about the climate change, of course, but perhaps it won't be a catastrophe. Siberia could use some warming. I mean, we don't know everything yet. I read something somewhere. Maybe they will invent something. This could just be another Y2K. But I couldn't drive away reality. So the guilt and shame started to kick in when I realized that I was part of the problem. In response, I attempted to purge myself of all greenhouse gases, and this is what the personal purge sounded like. So I changed all my light bulbs. I bought the really expensive, super efficient ones. Then I stopped drying my clothes in the dryer. Well, I also couldn't afford to because of all of the expensive light bulbs. And after this radical vegan activist with really bad breath screamed at me, I became a vegetarian for about a week. Oh, and that activist wasn't Elke. She has excellent breath. Oh, no. That was during the People's Climate March. Anybody go to the People's Climate March? There were these like really angry vegans, and the march, you kind of stops every now and then. This one guy's in my face, meat murders Mother Earth. I was like, put a mint in it, buddy. It was rough. But then the despair descended upon me. I realized that my individual efforts were pathetic in light of the weight, the vastness of the problem. And this is my despair voice. But what difference does it make? I purge myself dry. No one around me seems to care. And even if they did lower their own personal carbon footprints in the sand, it's like a teardrop in the ocean, which is quickly acidifying. The very roads they build for us are soaked in fossil fuels. The whole infrastructure is out of my control. It's like the trials of Job. Just curse God and die. My despair voice sounds downright biblical. But then something happened. I began to meet other people, like-minded people seeking solutions, and I found hope. And often, action is the antidote for despair, and this is my hope voice. We live in extraordinary times, so much uncertainty, dangers, and fears. But this is not our first rodeo. Our ancestors faced myriad challenges. Together, the Great Depression, World War II, they learned an important truth that we are discovering today. We are not alone. We have each other to comfort, to encourage, to join our voices together. And together, dear friends, we shall do the extraordinary. So let me tell you a very little bit about myself before I jump into the meat of what I'll talk about. So my name is Peterson Toscano. I live in Pennsylvania. I'm originally from New York and Connecticut. I come from an Italian-American family, Catholic, but I am no longer Catholic, a practicing Catholic. I am now a Quaker, which is kind of Catholic-like, when Catholics are quiet, like really quiet, like we don't have any talking for the most part. Like I said, I'm not an environmentalist, but I became concerned about climate change. In my work, I've been doing a lot of performance art. I'm a Bible scholar. I do a lot of work around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer concerns. And that's really, I was all involved with. And until something happened. I came home one day and my husband, Glenn, was in the bedroom weeping, face down. Now, Glenn is not a weeper, okay? I'm the weeper in the family. We have a very clear division of labor here. I weep, he comforts. It's simple. And so I was anxious, like this doesn't happen typically, and he's originally from South Africa, and I thought, you know, his family's, a lot of his family's there, he might have gotten bad news. Like, you know, I wanted to ask, like my mom always does when the phone would ring, who died? And I was like, what's going on? And he's weeping, and he points to a magazine, and he says, it's this article I read, it's about climate change. I was like, climate change? When have we ever talked about climate change? Ever. And I was like, what about climate change? He said, well, there's this, you know, the latest science has come out, and this was in 2012. He said, things are worse than they had expected. Things are happening faster than they feared. And how could I do my work as a creative writer, teaching at a university when there's this crisis happening? Now you have to understand something about Glenn. He's from South Africa and he was part of the anti-apartheid movement. And he was part of the queer liberation movement and the anti-conscription movement because they would force white men to fight in the army to uphold apartheid. And he was a draft dodger because of that. And so he's someone who, when he sees that there's something wrong in the world, he feels he needs to do something. And he's having an existential crisis. Now, not being the one normally doing the comforting, I was very awkward at the whole thing. I was like, there, it'll be okay. It's like we can, I don't know, do a little research, join a group. You know, what do you say? What do you do? And so that's what we did. Now, Glenn is a major, wonderful researcher. If you're on vacation, this is the guy you want to have. I mean, he's the guy who can find you the best pupusa restaurant in Philadelphia or the most robust response to climate change. So he's a good guy to have on your team. So he went off and did research, and he kept sending me articles. And I have to admit that at first, I was concerned, I was alarmed, but I wasn't moved. I wasn't moved to action. Until one day, until I read this one article that totally woke me up. It was an article about drought. And in it, it explained that on a warmer planet, there's going to be more drought because with hotter weather, it evaporates more. And if you had any plants outside this summer, you know, on hot days, you have to water them more. So the moisture stays up in the atmosphere longer and doesn't come down as often. And when it does come down, it's coming down more and more in a deluge, like we've seen, where it can rain in 2 days as much as it normally would in 2 or 3 months. We had it recently in Louisiana, Colorado a couple years ago. And they said, on a planet where there's a lot of drought, of course, there's going to be food shortages, starvation. There's going to be migration, mass migration, climate refugees. There's going to be civil unrest and instability. And this stuff, like, I understood and I was bothered by it, but it didn't move me to action. It still didn't grip me until the very end of the article. There was this one bit, and that's what did it. The writer ended by saying, and in a world with drought, there will be crop shortages and crop failures, including a potential global failure of wheat production, leading to a shortage in pasta products. Now, I'm Italian American. All right, so like pasta is Sunday afternoon, pasta is Wednesday night, pasta is Thursday morning when there's leftover and you fry it up in a frying pan. If you've never done it, it's sublime. And the thought of a world without pasta, okay, that was just too terrifying. And I'm not joking. I wish I were making that. I wish this was a joke. Oh, let's say something funny about that. That is literally the first thing that really, finally, it hit home. Which isn't so strange, though. Because climate change is a massive, complex issue. It's hard to get a toehold in it. And for many people, there's this one thing they finally like, oh my gosh, something in my life, something that's precious to me is threatened. And then that opens the door and you begin to look elsewhere. And that's what it was for me. And for other people, it's other food items. It could be wine, it could be chocolate, coffee. These are all potentially endangered species. Terrifying. How many of you heard Elizabeth Colbert when she spoke here recently on campus? Right. Yeah, she talks a lot about like extinctions and all. I heard her last year speak about that, and she's very clear about it. She's like, I'm going to tell you how horrible everything is. That's not my job. My job is not to tell you how horrible everything is. My job here tonight is to tell you that there are faith responses to climate change. And to do that, I'm breaking up the talk into 3 parts that I feel that we need to respond to climate change. We need to refocus, remember, and respond. We need to refocus, remember, and respond. And to me, I'm going to spend, well, for me, I'm going to spend most of the time on refocus because that's where we're at right now. We're at a place where we need to redirect the way we think about climate change and definitely how we talk about climate change. So of the things that we need to refocus, the one that I think is really critical is that we need to move away from individual actions to collective action. So in my monologue, I talked about all the things that I could do to lower my carbon footprint and how very much energy I put into that. And I think that's what we do. And I think it's a noble thing and the right thing to do. And similarly, on a campus of this size, it's essential that there be sustainability and we lower our carbon footprint. But I realize, though, that it is just a tiny percentage of what needs to be done. And I don't say this to discourage you, but to help us recognize the scope of the kind of response. And I'll give you a good example. I live in a very rural part of Pennsylvania, and many of my neighbors are Amish Mennonites. Old order. So no electricity, no gasoline that they use, or very little, some kerosene. And so they're pretty much living the environmentalist dream, right? Like really, really living off the grid. But do you know what the average Amish, what their carbon footprint is? How many tons of carbon they're responsible for polluting per person per year? Any guesses? You can talk to me, it's all right. Any guesses? Not even a guess? 20, that's a lot, but that's a good guess. The average American is 17, so we're responsible for about 17 tons of carbon per year per person. So think of like 17 tons of coal. So the Amish would be less than that. So now that you know that, let's readjust it. How much the average Amish is responsible for? 10, you would think, maybe like almost half. Any other guesses? 6. That would make a lot of sense too. It actually turns out to be 12. The average Amish is responsible for approximately 12 tons of carbon. When I first read that, I was like, wait a minute. Is it like all the fart from the cows? It can't be that bad. Do they pile all their manure in one way and it lets off all this methane? What the heck is going on there? And turns out they are responsible for so much pollution because they are Americans. It's simply that. You wake up, you're born in America, you're immediately responsible for about 12 tons of carbon per person. Because there is this whole infrastructure that's in place at our benefit. Those Amish, they hook up their little horse to the buggy. As soon as they go on the road, they're riding on roads that were made by fossil fuels, that are maintained and lit and patrolled by the power of greenhouse gases. All of this is taking place on our benefit around us with or without our consent. So to simply lower my carbon footprint, I'm still responsible for 12 tons of carbon per year. While in Sweden, which is also a very industrialized country, it's developed and much colder than around here, the average Swede is responsible for 5 tons of carbon per year. And that's because policy is different, energy's policy is different. And so in order for me to really be part of a solution, I need to do more than just clean house, but I need to be part of a movement that changes the way we get our energy. Signing things that will go to our lawmakers. And it sounds tepid, but it is absolutely essential to change energy policy. And when I think of faith communities and the power they have, I mean, obviously, in a church, you're not allowed to tell someone what candidate to vote for, although I've been in plenty of churches where they've made it very clear who they want you to vote for without saying it. But for years, churches and religious institutions have been involved in influencing and lobbying about public policy. And that, to me, the power of institutions like the Roman Catholic Church, which is so incredibly organized, has so many members, there's some real political power there. And I think that one of the faith responses to climate change is to organize so that we can change energy policy. Now, another thing I want to talk about, though, in refocusing is how we look at people. For the last 7, 8, almost 10 years, so much of the discourse has been around climate denial and people who are referred to simply as deniers in a very sort of rude way where people have all sorts of negative things to say about them. And one of the problems with the climate denial in America, and it is primarily an American issue. I talk to climate advocates all over the world, and I'll ask them, so what's it like in Costa Rica? What's it like in China and Nigeria? What's climate denial like? Oh, nobody denies climate change. They may not know enough about it, but nobody denies it. That's pretty much an American, somewhat Australian thing as well. But so much time and energy has gone into countering climate denial. So many climate presentations I see, about half of it is giving data and examples. See, it's really happening. See, and all this energy is being expended. In fact, Elizabeth Kolbert, when she spoke, I spoke with her afterwards, and she made it really clear, I'm not here to give you any answers, any solutions. Did she say something like that this time around, or is she sharing solutions? No solutions. And so she goes, I'm not here, I'm just telling, and then she told us, like, this is dying and that is dying, and you know, by the end you're like, thanks a lot, Elizabeth Kolbert. And so I said, okay, Elizabeth, what about this? What if, imagine, if for the past 10 years, there had been no climate denial. 10 years ago, everyone suddenly got on board and said, nope, climate change is clearly happening and it's human pollution is the cause. If that was the case, what would you be writing about today? What would you be talking about? And she immediately said, whoa, okay, well, and then she just spilled out all of these solutions. And if you're interested in hearing what she said, I have a podcast. It's called Climate Stew. If you just go to climatestew.com, look for Elizabeth Kolbert, you'll hear her answer. But our brains have been hijacked by this. But the worst part of it, I think, is people get dehumanized in the process, which I think faith communities of all people should be able to empathize and understand when somebody is struggling to accept something. So to give a little different switch about climate denial, to help us refocus and to humanize the experience, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite characters, Marvin Bloom, who will break down climate denial for you in a way that you're not used to. So excuse me for one moment while I slip into some Marvin Bloom. Oh, and I have very little control over what Marvin says once he takes over. Hi everyone, my name is Marvin Bloom. How are you? You doing okay? Yes, I'm very involved with climate work. I'm very concerned, but there's still hope, okay? I just need to make that very clear. There are solutions, all right? We're not dead in the water yet, okay? We haven't gone to hell in a handbasket, all right? All right, we can be honest here, right? We know the shit's gonna hit the fan, okay? But we don't know how much shit and how big of a fan we're gonna need to deal with it, all right? So there's lots of questions that are out there. But I do a lot of work around climate change. I'm involved with a group called the Citizens Climate Brigade with my partner, Tristan. And the number one question people ask is, what do I do about my coworker, my family member, my friends who is skeptical about climate change? They're denying it exists. And at first I thought, well, this is just weird, right? You have over 97% now of scientists saying that global warming is happening, human pollution is the cause. It's like saying cigarette smoking doesn't cause cancer. Yeah, tell it to your lungs, all right? And I'm like, this is weird. And I'm like, what is this denial? And I started thinking about it, denial. Denial. It reminds me of something. Denial. I know. It reminds me of Kubler-Ross. Have you ever heard of Kubler-Ross before? They're researchers. I don't know if it's one person or 5 people, but they did all this important research about grief, about mourning. Like when something terrible happens, like, someone you love has been diagnosed with something awful, or you find out you're not going to graduate on time, or I don't know, you find out that Lady Gaga has come out normal. And you go through this grieving process. And they've developed these 5 stages of grief. It's not the only way to look at grief, but it's one of the ways. And what is the first stage of the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief? Anyone? Denial. Denial. You're like, no, Ma can't be sick. Ma's never been sick a day in her life. She's too big to fail. So you push, you fight, you can't accept the reality. And that, I think, is what's happening with some of these climate deniers. They're like, no, if this is real, well, then everything's change, so it can't be real. So they push, they fight, they put all this energy into denying that this is happening, and this gives me a lot of hope, actually. Because what happens after they work through that denial stage and they move on to the other stages of grief, the anger, the bargaining, negotiating, the sadness and depression, it's going to get very messy, okay? But they finally come to the place of acceptance. Not acceptance that this is the end of the world, but acceptance that we've got a big problem and we got to do something about it. Then they harness all that energy they were using to deny and they put it into solutions. No, I really like that. I don't know, climate deniers, I don't know, I haven't feel a lot of hope about them. And I don't like it when people mock climate deniers and make fun of them. No, because there's something very honest about them, emotionally honest, even if they've got their facts kind of screwy. Now, there is a type of denier that I have no patience for. That is the hope denier. Now, this is the person that said, oh, we've gone too far. There's nothing we can do, and that's exactly what they do, nothing, no. Now, of course, there's a whole other category of people. These are people who know climate change is happening. They may be from a fossil fuel company. They may be in government, but they're misleading the public. Now, that's not climate denial. Those people are liars, and that's something very different. Now, my partner, Tristan, he's trying to get at me because, I have a soft spot in my heart for climate deniers, because if I'm honest with you, and why can't we be honest, right? I, too, am a denier. I'm not a climate denier, no. I wish that was a hoax. I'm alarmed about that. No. If I'm honest with you, I can tell you that I am a cholesterol denier. No, I don't think there is actually a thing, cholesterol. It's been manufactured by those grant-hungry American Heart Association doctors and those Quaker Oats people. Now, my partner, Tristan, says I'm wrong because I don't want to change my diet or whatever, but he's got his own heart-healthy lifestyle he's trying to shove down my throat. But that's another story. Ah, applause. They're waking up. It's so nice to hear. So, to me as a person of faith, I'm a Quaker, peace work is very important to me. And we live in a time when it's easy to be really angry at lots of people for what they've done and for what they say. And I feel that part of a faith response to climate change is to de-escalate that violence and to stop dehumanizing people and understand that we all struggle with denial of some sort. And refocusing away from pointing fingers is important, particularly because when the bar is set that, you have to accept climate change as reality, and if you don't, well, you're just a denier, well, it lowers the bar for everyone. Because as you're looking at other people's denial, we can't take time to see our own. And a spiritual practice, I think, that's really important in this time of climate change is to see, how am I in denial about this? Because really, if you fully embraced and understood what was going on, it's just terrifying and soul-shaking. We have to live with a certain level of denial. And so by pointing at other people's faults, it's easier for us to overlook our own. And also, I find that it really puts a low bar for politicians. Because right now, the bar is set like, there's all these politicians who are denying climate change. And I talked to lots of Democrat lawmakers. And basically, if they're not climate deniers, people are like, oh, they're such a good politician. I'm like, no, you need to do more than just acknowledge that this is happening. You need to really work towards substantive legislation to change this. I believe people of faith and faith communities, can really speak into the denial, because we may be witnessing a mass mourning period, and where we're seeing people really reacting to these big changes around us. I mean, the earth today is different from what I was born on. And I've often wondered, what would it be like if we had used some of these processes we have? The Catholic Church has all sorts of sacraments. The Quaker community, we have things. I've often thought, what would it be like if we went through a ceremony where we gave last rites to the Halcyon period, the period that we had lived on for the longest time until humans began to change the composition of the atmosphere, and now we're entering the Anthropocene, the first time in history that humans have literally altered the atmosphere in such a severe way. What would it look like to give last rites and to have a funeral mass for the Holocene as we embrace a new reality? Not that we're believing it's the end of the world, but it's the end of one world that we once knew, and we're entering a new phase. I think faith communities could have a really strong part in that. So we need to refocus. Next, I believe we need to remember. Are you all with me? We need to remember, and what we need to remember is this is not our first rodeo. All right, human beings have faced huge, horrible, devastating, terrifying things before. Potentials, extinctions, and exterminations. I mean, there was a whole generation of people alive today who grew up during a time where, as kids, they didn't think they would actually live to be adults because of all the nuclear threat. And there were lots of Catholics who were involved in helping with opposing nuclear weapons and fighting for, ending the arms race. And during that Cold War, a lot of people really thought that this could potentially be the end of the world, and we do have the power to make that happen. And there are other times in history, and I find for me, as a person of faith, it's really important for me to look back in time to see how have we, as a people, faced these kind of catastrophes before. And I do a lot of research around the siege of Leningrad, which took place in World War II. The city of Leningrad was surrounded for almost 900 days by Nazi forces. They were completely cut off for the most part. And so they had no food, no water. They were bombed 4 times a day. And what's extraordinary about them is not only that many people, not all, but many people survived. 1 million people died. But still, many people survived, but that they remained human through it all. And not everyone. Obviously, in desperate times call for desperate measures, and some people did things that were horrific. But for the most part, there was this amazing response. So after the first winter of the siege, so many people died. And they're being bombed 4 times a day. And something happened in the spring. People were like, we need to do something. And they began to clean the streets as much as they could. There were corpses everywhere. And they cleaned the streets, which was good because it would have brought a lot of disease. And then they started planting everywhere. There was food, no food was being airlifted in, so they began to chop up sidewalks and courtyards. They overturned tables. They planted everywhere. They planted so much food that by that November, they had a 4-month surplus of food that they grew in Russia. They have a very short season there. It's pretty amazing. University students continued their studies in bomb shelters. The symphony organized again, and even though they were so weak that only one section could practice at a time, they carried on playing to raise morale for people. There's a poet, Olga Bergots, who survived the siege, and she wrote about that first winter, and her words, I don't know, they really, to me, show this power that we have as human beings to find a way forward. Olga Bergots wrote, "That winter death looked straight into our eyes, staring long, without faltering. It wanted to hypnotize us, like a boa constrictor hypnotizes his intended victim, stripping him of his will, subjugating him. But those who brought us so much death miscalculated. They underestimated our voracious hunger for life." And in a time of climate change, it's so important to remember lessons that we learned in the past. And again, I think this is a spiritual practice. I don't know about you personally, but when I go through a hard time, it's really, really helpful to remember previous hard times and how I got through. And the church often is a repository of memories. And Scripture is as well, where we can look back in time and see how have we faced catastrophes before and not only survived, but remained human. And with that, I want to bring Marvin back. Is it all right if I bring Marvin back? Marvin, there's a very particular time in history that really moves me and I think gives real instruction to us today about how to respond to suffering and how to respond to climate change. And so I'm going to bring Marvin back for a little of that. And again, I don't always have control over Marvin. I'm just warning you. All right, everyone. So my partner Tristan and I, we're gay, obviously. We been thinking about what are some queer responses to climate change, because it's a very weird issue to begin with. So like, what's a queer way of looking at this? Now, worst case scenario, don't freak out, okay? But this is the worst case scenario. We're looking at the potential extinction and extermination of the human race. It's not going to happen. We're going to keep that from happening. We're going to work hard. You're going to be part of the solution. But think about it. What other people on the planet have faced potential extinctions and exterminations? Well, lots of people, but also LGBTQ people. I mean, I think about like my people, the Jews, during the Nazi period, right? The concentration camps. Well, Hitler had a whole hit list of people he went after, okay? Obviously, my people, but also Jehovah's Witnesses. I have no idea why. People with disabilities and homosexuals, as they were called back then. God help the Jew for Jesus in a wheelchair who's gay. Public enemy number one. And they did terrible things, and, but people had to figure out how to protect each other, how to survive, how to remain human in the midst of all that. And even today, we see potential exterminations with the incredible violence against transgender people, particularly transgender people of color. But there is this one period in history that it seemed like it was like the end for, gay people. And there was this disease, I was a kid, this plague that spread like wildfire called GRID. Have any of you ever heard GRID before? It's called the gay-related immune deficiency. It was this disease that attacked gay people. They later renamed it to HIV/AIDS, which I think you heard of. But first it was called GRID, or gay cancer, or some people like to call it God's punishment against homosexuals. Anyway, it was awful. I mean, there was a 100% fatality rate. If you had AIDS, you were going to die. And you had a government that refused to do anything about it. A president who wouldn't even say the words HIV/AIDS, and people suffering. And you had a public that was hostile and frightened and growing more hostile, and all the time you had people who needed help, who hospitals wouldn't take some AIDS patients, funeral parlors wouldn't take our bodies. And so our ancestors, they had to act up. They had to demand that the government do something about it. They got in their faces. They had to change public perception through storytelling, through art, through comedy, even through quilts, whatever it took, really. And they had to look after people who were suffering, like really suffering, learn medical procedures and figure out how to get food to people and how to get them clothing washed and all that. And they did an amazing job. I mean, there's still work to do, but in very short time, a lot happened. Policy changed, the world changed, and people's ideas and perceptions changed. They were fierce, these activists, but I have to say, though, there's lessons we can learn, how they responded, but also they made mistakes, too. I mean, they weren't perfect, right? Nobody's perfect. So like back then, if you had AIDS, you were going to suffer. Everyone suffered, but not equally, depending on your race, your class, your access to health care, your strata in society. You suffered more or less. I mean, if you were already suffering racism, sexism, classism, well, this was just added to that. I mean, yes, we were all in the same boat together, right? Just not all on the same deck. And that's exactly what it's like with climate change. Climate change is weird, all right? It affects women globally more than it affects men, which is weird. It affects people of color more than white people. It affects poor people more than rich people. So basically, climate change is sexist, racist, classist. We know what this is. We know how to respond to that, or we're learning, perhaps. Which reminds me, though, about Joseph. You know the story of Joseph in Genesis? Have you heard the story? Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? My friend Peterson, I don't know if you know him, he likes to refer to it as a princess dress, whatever. Anyway, there's a climate part of the Joseph story that's very important. Joseph was living in exile. His family kicked him out, and he's living as a slave in Egypt. He gets in trouble. He's in jail. And then Pharaoh starts having these weird dreams about cows. These 7 fat, beautiful cows and these 7 scary, skinny cows. And he's freaking out. He doesn't know what it means. He's like, someone interpret this. And they say, well, there's this guy, Joseph, in prison. He knows about dreams. Let's get him. So Joseph comes up, hears about the dreams, and he analyzes the data. And he predicts climate change. Well, a temporary regional climate change. He said the 7 fat, beautiful cows, that's 7 years of plenty. Things are going to grow beautifully. The 7 skinny, scary cows, yeah, that's 7 years of drought, basically eating up the fat cows. So he predicts climate change, and then he comes up with an adaptation plan. He says, well, if this is happening, right, we need to do something about it. So during those good years, let's grow as much as possible, put it in our famous grain silos, and then during those lean years, there's food for the people. Hooray, right? It's wonderful. It was a wonderful plan. In fact, during those lean years, that's when Joseph got reunited with his family, because they came to Egypt as climate migrants, refugees looking for food. So it was a lovely plan, except I have one critique about Joseph's plan. It was effective, but it wasn't just. In that, everyone was fed, but in order to get this food from Pharaoh, you had to pay for it. So at first people paid money, but then they ran out of money. They're like, now what? And Joseph said, all right, well, what do you got? Livestock. We'll take livestock. So they gave the livestock. And then they're like, now what? We don't have any more livestock. We're still hungry. Well, what about your land? How about you give your land to Pharaoh? You can still live on it, but you'll give Pharaoh, a lot of what you grow. All right, we'll give you our land. We need food. Then they're like, now what? We still need food. Well, what about your children? How about you give them to Pharaoh? They could be servants. We won't call them slaves, just servants. And then they still were out of food and the drought was going on. They're like, now what? And Joseph said, well, give your own bodies, give your life. You give yourself to Pharaoh. So basically the solution caused that Pharaoh would become the ultimate 1%, leading to oppression and slavery. Because the thing is, to me, a queer response to climate change is one that has justice and human rights at the heart of it. Right? So that whatever solutions we have don't basically help to magnify the oppressions we already have. Because why should we go and all the trouble to save civilization and everything that we hold dear if we're going to keep repeating the same crap we've been doing for thousands of years? No. I think we can do better than that. It's so important to remember in this time of climate change. It's so important to live that our brains aren't soaked with fear and shame. And this is one of my critique of many environmentalists, that their messages often lead with fear, be afraid, be very afraid, and then shame. You are part of the problem. And I know from being a communicator for many years, fear and shame, that doesn't motivate people. You might get them, temporarily excited, but it doesn't actually lead to any lasting action. And environmentalists are really good at pointing out sin, but there's no path typically to forgiveness and repentance. And those principles are faith principles that we often have, that there is a way of turning away from wrongdoing, being responsible citizens, and finding new life. Which leads me to the very last part, and that is to respond. We refocused, we remembered, and we respond. To me, climate change, what's faith got to do with it, is about response, not reaction. And it is so easy to react to climate change. But this requires thoughtfulness. This requires real care. Because as in the monologue with Marvin, we can come up with solutions that actually cause more problems. And we need to be really thoughtful. I mean, this is a big issue. And so we need to respond and not react. And to me, one of the things that's needed in this time is something known as discernment. It's kind of a fancy religious word about trying to figure out what's the right way to go. Now, I'm a Quaker, and in the Quaker community, we have this thing called queries, where it has nothing to do with being gay. That's spelled like query, not query, although I spell it wrong all the time. But queries are just questions that you ask and that you just sit with. And I think that one of our responses is to sit with different questions. So when I first had that moment with the pasta, and I began to look into climate change, some weird questions popped into my head that I couldn't shake. One was, what is a queer response to climate change? As a gay person, that was very stimulating to me. What does this have to do with LGBT people? Of course, everyone thought I finally had lost my mind. But I'm like, no, there's something there. And that question really helped me. The other question is, well, what would it look like if there was no climate denial? What would we be talking about? Another question is, what is the role of faith communities? And so Quakers, they have these queries. So I'm going to read you one query. It's from the Pacific Yearly Meeting, which is in the Pacific Northwest. And this is their query. In our witness for the global environment, are we careful to consider justice and the well-being of the world's poorest people? Does our way of life threaten the viability of life on Earth? And then this other one I find is really beautiful. It's from Australia Yearly Meeting. They say, all life is interrelated. Each individual plant and animal has its own needs and is important to others. Many species in Australia and worldwide are now extinct, and many more are endangered. Do you treat all life with respect, recognizing a particular obligation to those animals we breed and maintain for our use and enjoyment? In order to secure the survival of all, including ourselves, are you prepared to change your ideas about who you are in relationship to your environment and every living thing in it? So I think this is a time of queries. And one query I think is really important is to ask the question, what is my role on this new planet? What is my role on this new planet? Because here's the reality. We live in an extraordinary time that our whole species is threatened, along with plenty of others. And you are needed so desperately on the planet right now. Not as an environmentalist or a scientist, well, we could always use more of those for sure, but I don't care what you care about, it is threatened by climate change. If it is development work in Asia or Africa, if it is women's rights, if it's LGBT youth homelessness, if it's pets, if it's golf, everything is one way or another affected by climate change. And we need people who are filled with hope and compassion and love and caring to look out for everything that we hold precious and to help come up with solutions as we move forward. Now, I talked about spiritual practices. And for me, one of the faith responses to climate change is a very queer one in a way, and that is to imagine a hopeful future. To me, this is one of the greatest gifts that faith communities give to the world, is an idea of hope when things feel hopeless. And so I've begun as a spiritual practice to imagine, what does success look like? I mean, it's really easy to imagine a dystopian, horrible future. That is so easy, if it's in your own life or the whole planet. But to imagine a stable future, a hopeful, a more peaceful, just world, well, that takes a lot of work. And I think definitely in this time of climate change, one thing we're lacking is a lack of imagination. So I've written a series of monologues as a climate historian, 150 years in the future, who is looking back over time at all the amazing things the climate generation did to address this crisis. And the climate generation is you. And so I have about 50 monologues I've put together looking at every possible aspect of life. And there's more that I'm working on. And talking to people in the year 2166 about all of the amazing things their ancestors had done. So I want to end my talk before the Q&A by sharing one of those with you. I want you to imagine it's the year 2166, 150 years in the future. We're at Villanova University. Yes, it still stands. There has been trouble at times, severe storms, whole buildings were destroyed, there had been flooding for a time, but this university still stands, adaptations have been made, people are still needing to learn. There are new fields and there are old fields. And you have a special speaker. You have Dr. Timothy Meadows, who is a renowned climate historian. And he was asked to give a brief talk about the role of faith communities during climate change. And I always get a little choked up when I think about this. So imagine you're in this hall or another hall like it 150 years from now, and welcome Dr. Meadows with his climate talk. Good evening. During the first half of the 21st century, the climate generation responded to global warming with creativity and courage. In celebrating our ancestors tonight, we must not overlook the role of faith communities that they played on an uncertain and rapidly changing planet. Now, most people today are surprised when they learn that for a short time, some faith leaders discounted the threat of climate change. These skeptics actively spoke out against any form of climate action. The climate denial movement, though, quickly lost steam, and by the year 2017, faith communities took on climate change as the single biggest threat facing Earthlings. Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and other faith leaders organized movements within their existing faith communities to inform and to inspire. They created a vast network of resiliency support groups. They provided temporary and long-term shelter and sanctuary to climate migrants seeking refuge. They produced food, offered training, organized disaster relief, and gave much-needed moral support in the face of devastating losses in terrifying times. They stood as prophets, exhorting governments and citizens to place human rights and social justice at the heart of climate action. They aided the public in processing the strong emotions connected to a threatened existence: the grief, shame, anger, and hopelessness that at times gripped the climate generation. But behind every organization, institution, and action were people. Our great-grandparents, often afraid and uncertain, had to act as they took on new roles on a new planet. The inspired work of countless believers from diverse faith traditions provided essential help in responding to our climate catastrophe, shining light when we needed it most. Tonight, we celebrate our ancestors who faced an apocalypse and stood strong. On this day in 2166, we remember that day in climate history. Thank you. So we have a few minutes, not just for questions, but any comments or reflections or additions you may want to make to anything you heard here tonight. This may have inspired your own thinking. It may have confirmed some things that you've already been thinking about. So I have a mic here if anyone wants to do it, or you can just stand up and say nice and loud. We've got a question right there. Did you make that hat? It looks like a homemade hat.
I think it was.
Uh-huh.
Could you say anything about Citizens Climate Lobby? You mentioned the Citizens Climate Brigade. I feel there might have been a connection.
Yeah, you know what? When my husband first discovered Citizens Climate Lobby, and he said, "This is what we need to do. We need to get involved with helping to bring about political will to make some changes." And I thought it sounded really boring at first, talking to lawmakers, writing letters to the editor. I'm like, really? Can't we do something a little more sexy than that? And but then I went to Washington, and I've been now 5 times. I'm going again in November, and it was kind of stunning to get in front of lawmakers and begin to talk about it. And what I love about CCL, as a Quaker, I love about it because they're very much about respecting people. Not going in there to wag your finger at lawmakers, but always to lead with appreciation. Find something you can appreciate about that lawmaker. And it's amazing when you start that way how people relax and they open up. And it's very much about telling our stories. And in the 5 years that I've been doing that, we've seen actual big changes. When we first started, there was not a single Republican lawmaker who was willing to do anything about climate change. And a year ago, there were 12 of them, Republicans, who signed on to something called the Gibson Resolution, which is a conservative approach to climate change, saying it's happening, it's serious, we need to do something. And now there's a bipartisan climate solutions caucus that's happening. And so it's these beginning steps, these cracks in the wall, and almost all of that came about through relationships. By people getting to know their members of Congress, getting to know the staff in particular, who are quite young. Some of them are not much older than you. And it's been amazing. And something really extraordinary happens when young people walk in the room. I know Elke experienced this, and I saw it when we had high school students and college students talking to lawmakers. It's one thing for me to say, we need to act for our future generation. It's quite another when someone says, what are you going to do about my future? And they're like, oh yeah, that. So I'm going in November, and if you want to find out more about CCL, it's you just look at Citizens Climate Lobby, you can look at online. But the biggest thing that it gave me was hope. Because I'm a solo performance artist, I'm used to being alone in the work I do, but with climate change, I knew I needed community in a totally different way. And this is hard work. And to have people, have comrades to work besides, it is really, really helpful. And I feel so much more hopeful having a very specific plan. And the plan is very simple. It's that if you're going to pollute, if you're going to take fossil fuels out of the ground, you should pay for the right to do that. It needs to have a fee on it that rises over time. And that's the legislation, put a price on carbon. But then what happens if you have a price on carbon, everything goes up, energy, food, everything. So what are you gonna do about poor people and working class people? Well, the idea is then to take that money and distribute it to households to help with the rising cost, and it will help people during a great transition from dirty to clean energy. And I love it because it's market-driven in a way that conservatives like, and it's justice-minded, looking after people who are most vulnerable. And it's the bipartisan kind of solution that might actually work. Other questions or comments or additions? And if you have to go, you will not offend me. All right, you offend me. No, you don't. Any other questions or comments?
Is anyone doing this work in the community of so-called deniers? Do you know? I mean, I followed a little bit some of the shift among evangelical Christians, and I know there are some leaders there, but are you aware of anyone who's doing work at all comparable to yours?
I mean, in a way, we have been. People have been attempting to reach out to that community, throwing more science, more ways of talking about it. The most important thing with this sort of thing is who says it. People don't listen to messages. They listen to messengers who they respect. So when the Pope says something about climate change, suddenly there's a whole bunch of people who are listening who up until then could care less. And so the key is to find leaders. So you've got Republican lawmaker Bob Inglis who's speaking about this stuff. They will listen to him. There's others like that. But the reality is there aren't that many people who are skeptical of climate change in America. There's actually a tiny group, maybe 11%. It's not tiny, but there's this whole other group of people, many of whom acknowledge that climate change is happening, but they really don't want a lot to do with it. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are alarmed and have no idea what to do about it. I think the real goal is not to try to convert people, but to find the people who are concerned but doing nothing, to give them hope, to give them direction, to give them a way of understanding this so they can become part of the solution. Because there's a lot of people who are really concerned about it, and you get that political will, you get that group of people working, well then things will change, and people who are struggling to accept it for whatever reason, they'll come along. And I think more and more people are seeing it, particularly if they live in an area that's been affected, southern Florida, Texas, that sort of thing.
Following up on that, people are moving from looking at this as mitigation to looking at this as adaptation. It's here, we've got to deal with it.
Yeah.
And the attitude, I mean, Miami's spending $500 million to protect the Gold Coast on a yearly basis. They committed to adapting rather than passing a cost on carbon.
Right. Well, and
That's a crime.
it is, but it's a necessary one because they have to protect people. But the good news is these municipalities that are beginning to spend all this money to adapt, they're like, wait a minute, we need to do something. So you're getting pressures from cities and local governments, pressuring state governments, pressuring federal government. We need to do something. But it's true, we're going to have to adapt too because we cannot reverse what's happened. And things will continue, we have this pollution that's out there, things are going to continue to change, but we still have time to stop the worst effects and to begin to change that trend around because it's about pollution. And we know how to deal with pollution. There are ways, we've been dealing with pollution for decades. We know how to deal with pollution, and this is just really about pollution and how do we address this pollution. Other questions? Any students have anything to say? I don't know if I'm assuming that you weren't students. Any students are allowed to ask questions or comment? Really? No student questions or comments? Yeah, over there. Well done.
You said that climate change is sexist and racist and everything, but how is that?
It's not a joke. Okay, I thought it was weird too. I kept, when I was first doing my research, I was looking at climate change and social justice, and it says women are affected by climate change more than men. I'm like, what? How does that happen? And what happens is, globally, now I've seen it because I've been to South Africa, I've talked to folks in Nigeria. In many parts of the developing world, women stay more in the rural areas, while often men are off in the cities where there's money, jobs where they can make money. The women are often responsible, and the girls are often responsible for growing crops, getting water, getting lumber and fuel for fires. And so they're exposed a lot more to a lot of these things. So when there's drought, they have to go farther and farther to get water, which is less time in the home, which also is, they're more vulnerable to all sorts of attacks, including sexual assault. It's harder to grow food, and so we're seeing in places like the Solomon Islands where there's more and more flooding, and it's harder to produce food like they used to. There's more and more domestic violence that's happening, and starvation, which is affecting the women and the children in ways that's not affecting the men who are in the cities. And so they're the ones that are really on the front lines, and there are more diseases that are being spread. I mean, even now when you consider Zika virus and what's going on there, suddenly even the Catholic Church is starting to raise questions about contraception in South America during a time of Zika. I mean, it's really kind of amazing, that kind of thing, because women are affected by this, and of course their children. The UN has a lot of details and data about this. They come up with a report every year about women and climate change. Similarly, people of color, yes?
Can I just add to that?
Please do.
That environmental stressors make it more difficult for women to reproduce, what affects their reproductive health as well. So, and then to the developing fetuses, farms, there's a whole bunch of stuff that
Yeah.
environmental.
And when we're looking about people of color, obviously parts of the world that are most affected where it's mostly people of color are living, in Africa, parts of Asia. But even in America, when we look at what happened in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, we had a situation where there was a natural disaster that became a man-made catastrophe. And there were human rights abuses. You do the research, there were human rights abuses at the hands of soldiers who were trained to fight in Afghanistan. And they used these same methods on Americans, most of whom were African American. And there was lots of sexual assault, and people of color were very much affected by that. And they're also very much still displaced. There's still lots of people who were displaced in America who lived in New Orleans, and many of them were people of color. And I've been talking about how climate change is a Black Lives Matter issue in that during a time of natural disaster, the same rules don't apply with policing. You have the National Guard come in, and we definitely need more protections, and we need reforms in our police, but that needs to extend during times of natural disaster to the National Guard so that we're not seeing the same sort of institutionalized racism affecting people during times of disaster. Any other questions or comments? Yes, way in the back.
In that same vein, about the queer, how is it affecting queer people?
How does it affect queer people? It does affect queer people in some very interesting ways. For one, in Philly right now, there are a lot of homeless people, particularly homeless youth, and up to 40% of homeless youth are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. And these are kids who typically don't like going to shelters for some really good reasons. Shelters to them aren't necessarily safe spaces. They're run by churches and religious organizations, so they don't know where they stand with them. And they're highly gendered spaces. Boys there, girls there. What do you do if you're transgender or genderqueer? So they're like, avoid those spaces. So then what happens when the natural disasters come? Extreme heat, Superstorm Sandy. Where do these kids go? Do we know? Are we developing shelters specifically that welcome LGBT queer youth? That to me is a climate issue for sure. Similarly, another queer population that's very vulnerable are senior citizens. Unlike straight senior citizens, they often don't have the same social structure. They don't have the family structure traditionally. They may not have as much money because they were underemployed or they lost their work or they didn't get to save money in retirement in the same way. They are also much more, older people are much more affected by extreme heat, respiratory problems and all. So what happens when there's a heat wave and people are on a fixed budget and they don't have really people always checking in? Maybe they may check in with each other, but what about the LGBT community centers? Are they open with air conditioning that people can come? Do we have a list of our LGBTQ seniors in the community that we can check in on? To me, that's a queer family values issue. And a real practical way of building community while also considering people in a time of climate change. So those are two examples. There's a lot more we could probably talk about. Any final word? Last one.
I just want to add in that you were talking about the heat wave, right? So during this heat wave, like I had an interesting conversation with a friend here, and I was talking about, I think Philadelphia is the only place this time, like where there is like 4 people who died. And then I was surprised, like, you know, how many people die here. And it was probably people of color. I don't know their race, but I was just guessing. It's probably people of color, like, who don't have access to the air conditioning, that's why they died. And then about the other minority groups, and the interesting conversation was, like, probably the Hispanics, they are more social. So if they don't have the air conditioning, they would go to somewhere to go there. But if the people of color, maybe like they are not that social, then they just get stuck into that, and then that's how they suffer during this.
Well, who dies is usually people who don't have the money to run air conditioning 24/7, and there's a lot of poor people in America who can't, and disproportionately that's people of color in America, not exclusively. In Europe there was a big heat wave a couple of years ago, I think it was 2011 or 12, and tens of thousands of people died. I mean, the hospital's like, what's going on? Because there's a threshold that people can't handle it, and it affects the very old and the very young, first off. And that's true, and we're seeing more of that. And I think it's, bringing it back to our main point, what's faith got to do with it? I think it's also a wonderful consideration for churches who often have a little bit more money. They often have the AC on already. What happens if a church in a community makes it clear, anytime the temperature is over 95, the doors are open, come on in, we'll have activities, we'll have some snacks, we'll have some movies or whatever. It becomes a sanctuary during the heat. Not only will that help save lives, it will definitely save lives, it will also build community. And there are a lot of people who are lonely, and they want that. And there are a lot of churches that are desperate for new people in the door, so it's kind of a win-win all around. And in closing, I say goodnight to you all, and I'm very welcome to take more questions afterwards. I see, people often ask me, are you afraid about climate change, about what can happen to us? And I understand that there's going to be a lot of suffering, as there already is in the world. There's going to be more suffering. Climate change magnifies existing conditions. There are storms, always been storms, they'll be bigger. Drought, bigger. Floods, bigger. Suffering, greater. And I see that as a call to action, a call to mission. But I don't really feel fear most of the time. What I feel is this overwhelming sense of, gosh, what an honor to be the people on the planet right now who have the responsibility of looking after each other and surviving and addressing this crisis. It's a terrible honor, but it is an honor all the same. And I'm just excited to see the extraordinary things people do, because that's how we often respond to crisis. And I'm really honored to be in the room with you, because I have no idea how historically important you will be. But I have a feeling there are people in the room who are going to make some important contributions, and I feel honored to share this space with you tonight. So thank you so much for coming out.